About 90% of abiotically pollinated species are anemophylous, including all gymnosperms. Adaptation to wind pollination has resulted in the evolution of a wind pollination syndrome. A syndrome is a set of traits adapted to a specific selective pressure. The wind pollination syndrome results in small, inconspicuous flowers. Contrary to anime-pollinated flowers, these have no bright colors or pollinator rewards, and most of them do not even have petals, whose primary function is to attract pollinators and guide them to the floral reward. The stamens and stigma of wind-pollinated flowers are protruding and thus exposed to air currents. Moreover, the stigma is feathery, which allows it to catch pollen from the wind. The anthers produce a huge amount of pollen that can be carried by the wind, so it is light and smooth. Finally, anemophylous plants usually produce one seed per fruit, meaning that each stigma is connected to only one ovule. One of the biggest advantages of anemophily is that plants can reproduce without relying on biotic pollinators. Pollinators are unreliable pollen vectors. Take a generalist pollinator, for instance. They can visit several different types of flowers, mixing the pollen on their bodies. This can cause various problems with the reproduction of a plant. If the pollen of one species is compatible with another, the plant will produce hybrid offspring. Alternatively, if the pollen of the two species is not compatible, it can clog the stigma, preventing compatible pollen from sticking to it. Moreover, we already saw that flowers are costly structures, but flowers destined to attract pollinators are even costlier because the plant needs to invest in showy petals, scents, nutritious pollen or nectar, all of that instead of investing these resources into seed growth, for instance. Pollination by insect vectors does not require massive pollen production and can be very precise. In some plant communities, such as moist tropical forests, anemophily is almost completely absent because of the lack of sufficient air movement. Wind-pollinated species are prevalent in wind-swept temperate regions, such as those of northern latitudes and in communities of low species diversity. Thus, the proportion of anemophilous plants steadily increases with latitude and elevation, reaching 80 to 100% among the trees of the northernmost regions. Whether reproduction by wind versus insect pollination involves higher energy costs overall still needs to be determined. Another issue with wind pollination, which shapes the population dynamics of anemophilous plants, is that the pollen is carried by the wind in a random direction. The wind does not aim specifically towards other individuals of the same species. So if the wind blows in the wrong direction and there are not many individuals in the population, the pollen might be carried away without ever falling on the stigma of another individual. But if the population is very dense, so that each individual is surrounded by plenty potential mating partners, then the probability that wind pollination will be successful is much higher. This is typically one of the reasons why domesticated poaceae crops grow in large monocultural fields. This significantly increases their pollination success. Of course, increased population density also comes at the cost of increased interspecific competition. Thus, anemophilous plants need to grow at densities which optimize pollination efficiency but do not enhance competition. Beyond competition for resources, at increased plant densities there will also be increased competition for mating partners. If all plants release the pollen at the same time, they will be competing to pollinate the limited number of ovules available in the population. A solution for this would be to release pollen earlier. An individual that beats everybody else in the pollination race will have a lot of mating partners available. However, The timing should be just right. If the pollen is released too early, there is a chance that the females are not ready for pollination because their stigmas are not yet receptive. Thus, too early pollen release can result in a completely failed pollination.